Hello, and welcome back again to this episode of the Marginal Babble podcast. In today's episode, I sit down to talk with Dr. Toman Barsbai out of the University of Bristol to discuss his research into how recessionary periods impact migrants' behaviour. I hope you enjoy the discussion, and without further ado, let's get into the episode. Enjoy. How does a recessionary period impact migrants in comparison to that of a booming period in the economy?
We first have to talk about, what factors actually drive the economic integration of immigrants. And I just want to focus on the economic aspects of integration because I'm an economist, but obviously there's much more involved, right? There are political, social, cultural factors. But I just want to focus on, say, employment, wages you earn, occupations you take up in what I'm saying. So I think, obviously it takes two to tango. So two sides play a role when it comes to integration. On the one hand, you have the immigrants, and on the other hand, you have the host society, the destination countries. So maybe, let's start with a few factors at the side of immigrants. So there, how you enter a country actually plays a huge role. So you might enter the country as a labor migrant, so you already have a job upon arrival, so your economic integration starts from day one. Or alternatively, you might be sponsored by a family member who already resides in the country of origin, country of destination, and then, allows you to come over and join that family member. But these people, typically arrive without a job. And the same is the case for asylum seekers. So they might have a harder time to integrate into the labor market. Then, obviously, things like age of immigration also plays a role. So it's much easier for younger immigrants to learn a new language, learn how to navigate a different system. So that also plays a role. They usually integrate faster than older immigrants, even in economic domains. And then obviously, the time spent in the destination country also plays a role. So the longer immigrants are in a country, the better they integrate economically and eventually, converge to the economic outcomes of natives. So that's kind of the, side of immigrants. But then we can also talk about, aspects that are related to destination countries. So one important aspect, for instance, is, what is the legal framework? Are people allowed to work from day one in the destination country? Which is often not the case, especially for asylum seekers. So their economic integration is kind of delayed. And there are studies suggesting that, they will never make up for that delay, even once, they actually are allowed, at least legally, to work or apply for jobs. Then other factors like, how transferable is your education also play a role. So some countries make it quite difficult to get foreign education recognized. So lots of migrants, take up lower paid jobs because their formal qualification is not recognized. And then obviously, just the general attitudes towards immigrants also plays a role. So how easy it is for immigrants to interact, for instance, with local authorities. Do they offer their services in English, for instance, when we talk about non-English speaking countries? And discrimination, sadly, is also still out there. So lots of immigrants still fare systematically worse than comparable natives when it comes to labor market outcomes. So that's kind of the big picture of why economic integration of immigrants is often imperfect.
Yeah, exactly. And so to that point, what are the impacts on the economic environment when migrants don't integrate automatically into the society that they're moving to?
Right. So in this research, like we talk about now, we basically try to shed light on a new aspect of immigration. So as you already said, right, the economic integration of immigrants is often imperfect. That's kind of our starting point. So even when you look at immigrants coming from the same country of origin, you often see vastly differing immigrant outcomes. And what we thought might play a role here is the economic conditions you encounter once you arrive at the destination country. So basically, does it matter for your even longer run integration into a society, whether you immigrate into a boom or into a recession? So what role does the business cycle play in shaping your longer term path of integration.
Yeah, I see. And so does things along the lines of, I mean, you kind of mentioned it a second there, but language, I'm assuming, is a big part of that. If you're a migrant is moving from a country where they're speaking a similar language, that probably helps significantly in them being able to integrate into the economic market more effectively, as opposed to coming from a country with a different language set. Maybe there's some cultural factors as well that factor into that as well. But in terms of just the economic side of it, what are the factors that are preventing as much integration as we could do? I know in the research paper that you worked on, you were looking at the USA and the evidence from family migrants into the US in the recessionary period. But what are the factors that would inhibit the ability for the migrant to integrate economically into society?
So in our papers, we really just focus on the business cycle effects of immigration, and there we basically document that immigrants who happen to immigrate into a boom versus immigrants who happen to immigrate into recession are really differently affected when it comes to their long-term integration path. So one key finding is that immigrating into recession really leads to worse integration outcomes, both in terms of employment, though that's kind of like a short-term effect, but in particular in terms of the wages you earn, even like up to 10 years later. So what do we mean by like economic conditions upon arrival? So we basically look at like what is the labor, the unemployment rate at the time of arrival, so in the year of immigration. And we do that in the United States, where we look at family migrants. And we basically document that a 1 percentage point increase in the initial unemployment rate at arrival decreases your wages in the first 3 years by about 4%, and then subsequently by about 2%. So even after 10 years in the US, migrants who immigrate into recession still fare worse than those who immigrate into boom. And when you look at the, say, typical effects of a large recession, so an increase in unemployment rates by, say, about 5 percentage points, that translates into an income loss of about 36,000 US dollars for a given typical family migrant. So that's a sizable effect and something that most migrants will not be able to make up for in the future.
Yeah, so it's quite a sizable impact there. Was it just employment figures that you looked at, or did you look at other areas of economic booms and bust cycles within an economy?
So we mostly looked at economic outcomes. So we looked at employment rates. We find a short and not very strong effect on employment rates. So I mean, obviously, if you integrate or immigrate into recession, you will find it harder to find a job, especially when you look at higher unemployment rates at arrival. But that effect is really short-lived and disappears after 1 or 2 years. So what we really find is that recessions seem to push migrants into lower paid jobs. And these are typically jobs that have different task profiles. So we also find that these migrants are more likely to take up jobs with more manual tasks. So think about, say, operating a machine or being a construction worker. And they're less likely to take up jobs with like non-routine cognitive tasks. So for instance, like analyzing data or managing teams, like where interpersonal skills matter. These jobs are less likely to be taken up by immigrants who immigrate into recession. And we also find that, to cope with these kind of adverse economic conditions at arrival, they're more likely to rely on migrant networks. So they're more likely to find their jobs via job referrals, basically, of fellow country people. So they end up in occupations with higher concentrations of, fellow country people, which might also limit their upward mobility. And then finally, we also see like that those who immigrate into recession are also more likely to rely on the support of previous family members who migrated to the US. So they're more likely to stay or still reside with family members who had migrated to the US before them, which kind of implies that they need to rely on this kind of support of their family to deal with these adverse conditions, and that immobile support provided by the family might also reduce their geographic mobility. And together, these different factors like occupational downgrading, finding a job via migrant networks, relying on the family for support, together these factors might explain why immigrating into recession has such long run and persistent effects on the economic outcomes of immigrants.
Sure, and obviously those impacts are going to be along the lines of how much income they're going to generate over their lifetimes and how much wealth they'll be able to accumulate. Are there any other economic aspects other than the actual individual's wealth or the wealth they'll be able to build for themselves that ends up being detrimented as well over that period of time, or is it just simply the relative incomes of that individual?
So in our study, we only basically document the facts I've just summarized. But I do think it would be interesting to look at, say, non-economic outcomes. So for instance, how does immigrating into recession or into boom affect your social integration, so your language skills? Maybe you're more likely also to invest in additional education, right? You might think, maybe now is not the time to find a job. I'd rather, get some extra vocational training or visit a college to get an additional degree and then enter the labor market at a more favorable time. So that might also be the case. And obviously, other outcomes such as your political views or whom you marry, which kind of neighborhoods you live, that might also be affected by the business cycle. But these are really questions that we will need to look at in future research, or others, of course.
Sure. And what were the methodologies you used in this research? What were the data sets you used? What kind of interrogation techniques did you use upon that in order to come to the conclusions you did?
So we used data from the American Community Survey and the US Census. So they gave us a big picture view of all types of migrants in the US. So it's really hundreds of thousands of observations we can rely on. So the big challenge we face empirically is that the economic conditions upon arrival, of course, also matter for migration decisions. So say you're an immigrant, you're somebody residing in the Philippines and pondering whether or not to migrate to the US. You might just observe the labor market, right? And when conditions are good, you might decide to go. Whereas when conditions are not so good, you might just decide to stay back, right? But other people might make different decisions. So the key challenge is that those who arrive at booms versus those who arrive in times of recession might differ from each other in terms of characteristics. So any differences we then document for economic outcomes might be due to different, profiles of migrants and not necessarily different economic conditions upon arrival. So to kind of address this challenge, we rely on family migrants. And the key idea here is that family migrants need to wait for years to get their visa issued. And the reason for that is that there's a huge queue for visas because there's a cap on the annual number of visas available for family migrants, which implies that when you apply for a visa, so when you actually take the decision to migrate, you will still need to wait for years to actually get the visa. And that basically implies that we can decouple the migration decision from economic conditions upon arrival. Because at the time of applying for the visa, you don't know how the US economy will look like, because that's going to be 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the road. So basically, the decisions you will encounter in the future are going to be beyond your control, and that's what we kind of exploit. So some migrants happen to immigrate into recession, whereas others happen to immigrate into a boom. And now you might say, are family migrants relevant? So maybe we should focus on other types of migrants. But yes, they're really relevant. So they account for the vast majority of green card holders in the US. So every year, the US issues about 1 million green cards, and about 2/3 of those, so roughly 700,000, are accounted for by family migrants. So that's a really sizable flow. So labor migrants, at least when it comes to permanent migration or green card holders, play a much less significant role. And the picture is kind of the same across the OECD countries. So family migrants, we think, are a very relevant and at the same time also understudied group of migrants. But the neat feature really here is that, they basically need to apply for their visa years in advance, so they cannot predict how economic conditions will be once they actually enter the US. And that's what we kind of exploit to estimate the effect.
I see. And so it's not as though these individuals coming in on family visas are able to particularly time their entrance depending on whether it is like a boom or bust cycle because of the delay in them actually being able to be let in, essentially, from the sounds of it.
Exactly. And that's, say, in large contrast to, say, labor migrants, right? So these are migrants whose visa is sponsored by employers. So obviously, firms will have more demand for labor in booms versus busts. So there's a direct link between economic conditions and the number of and the type of labor migrants arriving in the US, whereas you don't see this pattern for family migrants. And that's precisely what we exploit here in this research.
Sure. It may not be implicit, obviously, in this research, but you mentioned there's obviously different economic outcomes for migrants depending on which path they come in on. Can you speak a little bit to potentially the differences in the economic outcomes from those different migrants at all?
Yeah, so basically, I think we can distinguish by and large between three big groups of migrants. So we have labor migrants. So basically, they come because somebody has hired them and their visa is sponsored by a company. Then we have family migrants. So these are people who migrate because another family member is already at the destination. So their visa is sponsored by, those family members who already reside in the destination country. And third, we have asylum seekers. So they are basically fleeing from their country of origin and try to apply for asylum. So in contrast to labor migrants, family migrants and asylum seekers often arrive without a job. So I think one, at least, benefit that family migrants have is, their migration decision was voluntary, right? So they decided to migrate and they have a network to already, draw on in the destination country. They can ask their, relatives for support. They have a home where they usually reside for the first few years. But still they arrive without a job, right? So they have to enter the labor market, and that will take a bit of time, depending on the initial skill set you have and how old you are, etc. Asylum seekers, like family migrants, also arrive with a job, but they face more hurdles because they, in most cases, are not able to start looking for a job. So many countries impose restrictions here. So in some countries, you're not allowed to work for a couple of months, and then only after that are you allowed to look for a job. And you might not be able to take on full-time jobs because the annual limit on your earnings might be capped. And there are other countries where you are not even allowed to work until the decision of your application has been made. And that, given the recent numbers of asylum seekers, can take months or even years. So that really delays their economic integration. And of course, the uncertainty that many asylum seekers have about their longer term status in a country also plays a role. So you can think about migration as a kind of investment decision. So obviously, it's a huge thing to move abroad, right? So you leave your family and friends behind. You have to potentially learn a new language. You have to build new networks. You learn to navigate a different system. So that's a huge task, and there's a huge cost. But of course, there are huge returns, right? The income differences between low income and high income countries are huge. So there are lots of potential returns you might reap from international migration. But obviously, the more uncertainty you have about your duration of stay in the destination country, the less willing you might be to invest in, say, learning the language, getting your qualification recognized, or looking for a job. So having this longer term perspective really matters, and that's why we observe that for many asylum seekers, at least their initial integration path is often imperfect.
Sure. And I understand you may only be able to speak to this anecdotally, but why is it in these particular scenarios that asylum seekers aren't permitted to work within the first period of time that they come into a country? Is there a reason that maybe it's for security reasons or something else that they're stopping that economic integration?
I mean, it's really hard for me to say because I don't really do research on refugees or asylum seekers. But the main reason is often, that these policies reflect what natives want. So there's a demand for, restricting the inflow of asylum seekers. So lots of destination countries have installed policies that make it less attractive, in the first place, to move to the destination country and apply for asylum. So I'm not really sure whether these policies work in the sense of deterring, applications of asylum seekers, but they do have an effect on the economic integration of immigrants or refugees. And I think these effects are detrimental for both the refugees, but also for the natives, because obviously, better economic integration also benefits natives, because refugees, for instance, who are economically better integrated, will pay higher taxes. They will be less likely to use the welfare system. They might also, by earning higher incomes, induce demand for locally produced goods and services. So basically increase demand for native workers, at least to some degree. So it's a win-win, at least in my view, to integrate these people economically, both for the refugees or immigrants, but also for the natives.
Sure. And how many refugees are allowed into the United States? Because that's obviously the area of your research in a particular given year that we would be talking about in that scenario.
So I'm afraid I don't have the exact number in my mind. But given that the United States is geographically quite isolated and quite far from many countries where people flee from, the number, at least comparatively speaking, is much lower than in most countries in Europe. I mean, Europe is close to the Middle East, close to Ukraine, also closer to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where lots of refugees come from. And it's incredibly hard for those people to make their way to the US. So in contrast to Europe, where basically asylum seekers arrive in a destination country and then apply for asylum, the US and Canada as well, and to some extent the United Kingdom as well, they rely on resettlement. So this means that people apply for asylum outside of the country they're applying for asylum in. And then once the application has been granted and the visa has been issued, they basically enter the destination country regularly and with a long-term visa. So lots of refugees arriving in the United States, including some of my family members from Syria, they arrived with green cards in the United States. So they could basically start their economic integration from day one. That's also a key difference between the US and lots of European countries. So their numbers are lower, but also the type of refugees, or the pathway they admit refugees, is different because they go through resettlement versus what Europe does, where people basically arrive first and then apply for asylum.
Sure. And that resettlement, at least, and this may be somewhere where I'm slightly ignorant on, but that does actually seem a much more productive way, at least from an economic integration standpoint, because if they can work from day one, they are much more likely to contribute to the economic society at large, right?
Yes, I would totally agree. So I think removing this uncertainty about the outcome of the application, but also like giving people like a long-term horizon so they can actually plan and invest accordingly, right, is really important. And that's typically not the case when you have to wait for asylum in the destination country and are barred from employment. So that's important. But on the other hand, often the political forces then dictate that the number of accepted asylum seekers is much lower in this case, right? Because you have more control about the number of people who arrive. So typically we see fewer like resettled refugees than people who arrive and then need to make their claim in the destination countries.
I see. And you say that in particular for the United States, partly because of the geographical situation, that green card situation is much more apparent than maybe it is in Europe, where people are fleeing and then trying to settle essentially, rather than applying for resettlement at the beginning of the process.
Exactly. Though, I mean, in recent month or the recent 1 or 2 years, of course, the US has also seen an enormous inflow of people from Latin America, and many of them entered irregularly. So you can see the political backlash in the United States. But that's kind of like a more exceptional period.
Sure, and obviously migration patterns obviously will depend massively on things that will change over time. For example, war and scenarios like that, and fleeing from certain countries are going to affect those figures over time. So it's an ever-changing situation. So just by saying one thing at one time doesn't mean it won't change in the future. Is there a policy change that you see that could be implemented by the United States, or perhaps by even some European countries, that would at least assist in the economic integration of migrants, even in downturn times? We're currently supposedly in a recession at the moment. Is there something that we could be doing policy-wise to positively impact the economic integration?
Oh, that's a great question. So actually, we discussed at length whether there are any policy implications to draw from our paper. So when it comes to immigrating into recession or a boom. So the thing is, at least in the US, once the visa is issued, you only have a very limited time window to make your move to the United States. That's typically about a year, plus minus, so 12 months about. And obviously, that basically means that if the US happens to be in a recession at that time, you have to take it, right? I mean, it's now or never
right.
Once the visa is granted. So you don't really have the opportunity to delay your migration. So one potential implication might be, allowing migrants to delay their immigration and wait for better economic conditions. But we actually don't think that this is a meaningful policy, because what we have to take into account is that there are massive, and I really stress massive, differences in income between low and high income countries. So say the typical countries of origin of family migrants, so Mexico, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, Dominican Republic, they have much lower GDPs per capita than the US. So even if the US is in a recession, it will still be very attractive for you to leave, because your wages are going to be a multiple of what you earn back home. So probably you would not wait, right? You would still make the move and go there. So I think our findings help understand why economic integration differs across and within migrant cohorts, but they don't really give us a clear policy implication. But more generally, going beyond our particular paper, I think starting points would be to, remove labor market restrictions that apply to migrants. So one potential avenue would be, for instance, to be less strict when it comes to allowing asylum seekers to look for jobs, and annual limits some countries put on their earnings. These could be lifted. I mean, that would encourage migrants to start looking for a job, or refugees start looking for jobs early on. And one other avenue would be to make it easier for migrants to get their foreign qualifications recognized in the destination country. So lots of occupations are licensed for good, but also sometimes for bad reasons. So it's often quite cumbersome to get a foreign degree recognized, which often results in so-called occupational downgrading. So you find highly skilled migrants in jobs
Yeah,
that
of
are
course.
actually far below their like human capital levels. So that's also an area I think where more action is needed. And it doesn't mean that the processes need to be less stringent, but I think they could be faster. So lots of countries take a lot of time to process these applications, and I think this could be done faster. And then lastly, just providing migrants with a long-term perspective is important, because that just incentivizes migrants to invest in destination-specific human capital. So that's just econ jargon for learning the language, acquiring education that is recognized in the destination country. So the longer the time horizon you can plan with, the more likely you should be to invest in this destination country specific human capital, and easy and clear pathways to citizenships reinforce this relationship.
Sure. Those are all sort of very interesting points in their own regard, truthfully. In terms of that last point, the very first podcast episode I ever conducted on this channel was in regards to re-immigration intentions with migrants. And it was very obvious in that research that Bastian had conducted that if you make visas harder to get or you reduce their time and things like that, there is just going to be less integration into not just the cultural side of things, but obviously the economic side of it as well. Because to your point, there's less certainty. And as with any investing, you need certainty in order to be able to plan for future economic benefits. You're not going to spend your time or your resources reskilling for a certain location if that is not going to potentially pan out and that skill or qualification isn't going to work in another country, for example. So I think that's a really interesting point just in regards on re-immigration intentions and getting the most out of every migrant from an economic standpoint. Now, that sounds very empirical because obviously these are people with thoughts, feelings, things like that. But I do think there's, fundamentally you want migration to enhance society from a cultural standpoint, sure, but also from an economic standpoint as well. And if you are going to limit it, which it does seem to be the case in America, I'm sure other countries as well, with like the visa quotas and things like that, that you want to make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck out of every single person that comes over, right, in terms of that economic benefit. So that's that point. But then going back to your first point there, in regards to not allowing, for example, asylum seekers to work when they enter the country, the only benefit I can really see from that, from an economic point of view, is just to de-incentivize asylum seekers. Because from an economic standpoint, having someone come to the country and wait potentially years before they can even start working in the country seems to be more of a drain on resources more than a pro on or a force for resources. You would much rather someone, even if you were giving them housing and all these kind of things, you still rather than be working, even if it's in a low skilled job where you're providing goods and services to the economy. Because even if it is lower skilled stuff, they should still be paying some level of tax, but usually they're providing skills, even if it's like coffee in a coffee shop or something. They're providing coffee services to people that are doing things in their daily lives that are of higher earning potential. So there's almost like a multiplier effect. I think you could maybe even see within that. That's even like maybe implicit in like the tax revenues potentially that you would be seeing. And so the only real side I can really see on that is really just to de-incentivize asylum seeking, to make sure that it isn't as lucrative, or it seems lucrative, to potential asylum seekers, which I would have imagined you could have maybe got out in front of by just limiting the total amount of asylum seekers in a given year. Can you? I don't know whether you happen to know anything about this, but why is it that those economic limitations are put on asylum seekers as opposed to just limiting the total number of them, for example?
Yeah, no, these are really, really good and tough questions. So I totally agree, right? Allowing people to integrate early on should be beneficial, like for refugees who have already arrived, right? Now, in my view, but there's no hard evidence on this. In my view, I don't really see that these restrictions have reach the objective of limiting the inflow of asylum seekers. because obviously, like, asylum seekers also make a choice of where to go, right? And from what I can tell is that, asylum seekers look at the general, like, economic conditions in a country. Is it a rich, is it a poor country? Will I have a safe economic future there? Will I be able to find a job? So labor market potential does play a role in this. And then also, like, the ease of integrating, maybe also in terms of, like, cultural ways, like, do I know the language already in the destination country, which of course makes the UK very attractive, to some degree France, but other countries with less known languages fare worse in this regard, so they're less attractive for asylum seekers. So I think there's no clear evidence that really shows that limiting asylum seekers' possibilities when it comes to working early on really deters them from making the migration decision in a different way. And it's very hard to limit the number of asylum seekers because, as I said, like, we don't, at least in Europe, we don't have a system that relies heavily on resettlement. So, Europe has most of refugees arriving on its shores, right? So people travel to the countries first and then apply, and it's very hard to secure the border, as we see in recent years, right? So there's lots of immigration and asylum seekers coming in, and not so much control over the numbers.
I see. So this is an advantage potentially America has because of the size of the country and its geographical location. They can encourage the use of the settlement asylum program and that encourages them more to do so. But in Europe, because of the proximity and the geography, it's very difficult to encourage the settlement situation when you're probably getting the total number of asylum seekers that you would want to allow into the country just arriving on your shores in a yearly period. So maybe that's not such a clear-cut solution in regards to encouraging the settlement program of asylum seeking. I do wonder how the UK fares in this regard because it is geographically isolated from the rest of Europe from the sea. And I would imagine Italy. I know there's been reports in recent sort of history in regards to Italy, for example, having sort of like a migrant boat crisis. I do wonder how the numbers would fare comparatively between mainland Europe and Britain just because of the geographical factor.
I mean, there's a vast difference. So, I mean, there's lots of talks in the UK about immigrants or refugees arriving by boat. But, when you compare that to the number of refugees arriving in Italy, Greece, or the ones in Germany, there's a huge gap. So it's just a fraction of refugees actually finding their way to the UK. So it's a completely different league. So again, like, being geographically isolated pays off in terms of having a lower number of refugees. But at the same time, I also want to stress that, like, at least from an economic point of view, hosting refugees is not something bad. So especially when refugees are, given the opportunity to integrate early on, they do particularly well. And that is even more so for second generation immigrants. So, children of refugees or children of immigrants more generally, they do stunningly well on the labor market and often outperform natives. So they have higher paid jobs, higher employment rates than natives, make more contributions to the fiscal system. So at least in economic terms, it's very hard to make an argument against hosting refugees or immigrants more generally.
And to that very point, and the second issue you brought up a little while ago, the transferability of skill sets and qualifications is actually a very interesting point in this regard because so much of skilled work requires some level of qualifications. So you need a medical degree to be a doctor. You need to have your CPA or accounting qualifications to be an accountant, a law degree, or pass the bar exam to be a practicing lawyer. And I would imagine this will be different depending on the sector and the industry you're looking at. But if synergies between certain countries aren't as efficient as they should be, it probably would lead to more underskilling or underutilization of migrant workers, whether asylum or employee-based or work-related, in that regard. So, I mean, I don't know how it works, for example, with like India and the UK in terms of transferability of like a medical degree or a doctorate in medicine. I know, for example, in accounting, that if you are a qualified accountant in South Africa, there is like a qualification you have to do in order to bridge the gap between that and the UK level accountants. But it wouldn't necessarily inhibit you from being employed. It would take you, once you arrive, 6 months to make sure that you're up to date on the speed, or however long that time period is. I'm not entirely sure in that regard. So that seems to be an interesting synergy there, that people can still be employed over. They can do that sort of specific dedicated qualification to get them up to speed to what it relatively is in the UK, and then they can continue their economic benefit in the UK, where potentially there's better institutions and structures to get more value out of their individual employees. So I think it would be relatively good in that sector. Do you think that, well, I don't know how much you'll know about this, the general synergies across all industries, and whether there's something that we could be doing to encouraging those synergies between particularly qualifications, I would imagine, and the transferability of those skills, to make sure that we're not underutilizing the skill sets of migrant workers coming over?
Oh, that's a really good question, and I'm afraid I don't have much to say on this, apart from just making this point again that it will pay off if we make it as easy as possible and as easy as feasible to get these formal qualifications from abroad recognized in the destination countries. Of course, like without with also like making sure that people have the qualifications it takes to fulfill their jobs, of course, right? So there should not be any shortcuts here. I think one other factor is that many destination countries don't fully realize, or the public, is like how much competition there is over talent in the world, and that lots of skilled people actually now have a choice, right? They can choose whether to migrate, say, to the UK, to Germany, to Canada, to Australia, to the US. And as the demographic change progresses, so lots of our societies are getting older, right? We need to rely more on recruiting workers from abroad, at least in some sectors. This competition will just increase over time. And even countries like China, I expect, will see a lot of immigration in the future. So it should not be the case that, as I think many destination countries see it this way, it's a privilege, like, to allow migrants to come to us and work here. They should, I think, also, increasingly adopt the view that it's a privilege to have people come to our place in the first place, right? That they choose us over others. So I think, having generally like welcoming culture of integrating migrants and welcoming people from like different parts of the world with different cultural backgrounds will also play an increasingly important role in the future.
Yeah, of course. And just to finish up on, with this research and the findings that you had, is there any particular research or study or area of study that you would like to see conducted in the future or expanded upon in order to really build upon the findings of the research that you found here?
I think there are two aspects where I would like to see a bit more exploration. So one is like finding out about how economic conditions upon arrival shape non-economic outcomes of integration. So the social, the cultural, the political dimensions of integration, I think, would be interesting to look at. And the second factor or aspect, I think, which might be interesting, is to understand family migrants better. So we have a lot of research in the past on economic migrants or labor migrants. So, people who basically immigrate because they have found a job. We also have increasingly better evidence on refugees and how they fare, how they integrate. But we still know very little about family migrants, which, as I try to make the case, account for a large share of permanent migrants to most OECD countries, including the UK. So that's an important gap, I think. And I think what makes family migrants interesting is that the migration decision is now not only made by the people who move, right? So the people who stay are in the country of origin, but the people who sponsor their visa, so the people who already are at the destination, also have a say, right? Whether they want to sponsor your visa or not. And I think understanding these decisions is something that would be nice to have in the future.
Yeah, that sounds really sort of value adding and beneficial. Yeah, so thank you very much for your time, Tom, and I really do appreciate it. Do you have any research coming out or any pieces of work you'd like to point any listeners to?
Thanks, Max. I have a few papers coming out on migration. So the paper you mentioned, or we discussed, the Migrating of a Recession paper, and then I've two other papers that are coming out very soon. One is looking at ways to protect migrant workers going from the Philippines to the Middle East and protect them from exploitation, so improve their working conditions abroad. And the other one is about family migrants from the Philippines to the United States and understanding whether providing them with information about how to integrate into the US before departure improves their migration outcomes. So I can send you the link, and interested listeners or readers can have a look.
Excellent. So links to that research and Toman's other research will be included in the description down below. Guys, thank you for joining us on today's episode. And until the next time, we'll see you soon. Thank you again, Toman.
Thanks, Max. It's a pleasure being here.